The sun was rising slowly, casting a golden glow across the airport runway. Inside the busy terminal, passengers rushed to their gates, dragging suitcases, sipping coffee, and checking their boarding passes. Among them was a well-dressed woman named Mrs. Sandra. Sandra was confident, sharp, and always dressed to impress. Today, she wore a designer coat, high heels, and carried a handbag that screamed money. She was flying first class, as usual. To her, flying economy was never an option. She walked gracefully to the gate and showed her ticket. The airline staff smiled politely and let her through. Sandra didn't smile back. She rarely did. Inside the plane, the air smelled of fresh coffee and leather seats. Sandra looked around at the luxury cabin of first class and nodded in approval. She made her way to her seat -2A. As she reached her row, she paused. In seat 2B, right next to her, sat a young black boy. He looked around 6 or 7 years old, wearing a small red hoodie and holding a toy airplane in his hand. His eyes were wide with excitement. When he saw her, he smiled sweetly and said, "Hi." Sandra's smile disappeared. She froze for a moment, then narrowed her eyes. "Excuse me," she said sharply, waving over a flight attendant. "There's been a mistake." The flight attendant, a young woman named Rachel, stepped forward politely. "Yes, Mom." Sandra pointed toward Jaden. "I paid for a premium seat. I'm not supposed to be sitting next to him." Rachel looked confused for a moment, then checked the seat number on Sandra's ticket. "No mistake, ma'am. This is your seat." Sandra crossed her arms, visibly annoyed. "You expect me to sit here next to it, child, in first class." Rachel shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, the flight is completely full. There are no other seats available." Jaden looked up at Sandra, confused. He didn't understand why she was upset. He just wanted to fly. Sandra sighed loudly and rolled her eyes. "Unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head. "They let anyone in first class these days." Other passengers nearby started turning their heads. Some frowned. Others looked at each other quietly, sensing the tension. But nobody said anything, yet. Jaden slowly turned his head toward the window. His small hands clutched the toy plane tighter. He tried not to cry. He had been so happy just a few minutes ago. Now he felt like he didn't belong. Rachel, the flight attendant, gave Sandra a polite but firm smile. "Please take your seat, ma'am. We're preparing for takeoff." Sandra huffed and sat down stiffly, placing her handbag between her and Jaden like a wall. She pulled out a magazine and began flipping through it angrily, not really reading anything. Jaden stayed quiet. He looked out the window as the plane backed away from the gate. His reflection in the glass showed a small boy trying to be strong. He didn't want to make trouble. He just wanted to fly peacefully. Rachel walked down the aisle to the back of the cabin. As she passed another flight attendant, she whispered something. The other attendant's eyes widened. They both looked back at seat 2B. Sandra leaned back in her seat, pretending Jaden didn't exist. But her words had already been heard by several passengers. One older woman across the aisle gave her a long, disappointed stare. A young couple in row 3 shook their heads. Jaden didn't notice. He was staring at a photo he pulled from his pocket, a picture of him and a smiling man in a pilot uniform. He whispered to himself, "I'm proud of you, Dad." Back in the galley, Rachel pulled out a small phone and made a quiet call. The camera could now focus on her mouth as she said softly, "Captain, we might have a situation in first class. It's about your son." While Sandra sat stiffly in her seat, still annoyed, the flight attendant Rachel walked quickly toward the cockpit. Her face was calm, but her heart was racing. She reached for the phone near the service area and dialed a short code. "Captain Daniels," she said softly, "we have a problem in first class. It's about Jaden." There was a pause on the line. Then a voice replied, serious and strong. "What happened?" Rachel looked around before speaking. One of the passengers. She refused to sit next to him. She made some very unpleasant comments. Jaden hasn't said a word. He's trying to be brave, but he looks hurt. Another pause. Then came the quiet reply. Thank you for telling me. I'll be there soon. As Rachel hung up, she took a deep breath and headed back toward the front of the cabin. She glanced at Jaden. He was still staring out the window, holding his toy plane in one hand and the photo in the other. Just a few hours earlier, that same morning, Jaden had walked into the airport with a small backpack and big excitement in his eyes. People looked at him with curiosity. He wasn't dressed like someone important, but the way the airport staff treated him said otherwise. "Good morning, young man," said the check-in agent with a big smile. "Hi," Jaden replied happily. A man in a pilot uniform walked over, smiling warmly. It was Captain Daniels, his father. "How's my co-pilot today?" he asked, giving Jaden a fist bump. "I'm ready to fly, Dad," Jaden said with a grin. A security guard walked beside them as they moved through a private entrance. Even other pilots nodded at them with respect. Jaden didn't notice. He was too excited. At the gate, Captain Daniels knelt down and looked Jaden in the eyes. "I won't be sitting with you, buddy. I'll be in the cockpit, but you'll be safe. Rachel and the crew will take care of you, okay?" Jaden nodded bravely. "I'll be good." Captain Daniels smiled, gave him a hug, and said, "That's my boy." Then Jaden boarded early, escorted by the crew. Nobody at the gate knew who he was, except the staff, and they didn't say a word. Now back in seat 2B, Jaden replayed his dad's words in his head. "Be strong." That's what he had said. He tried, but it was hard. Sandra's mean words had hurt him. Across the aisle, an older woman named Mrs. Wilson noticed Jaden's silence. She leaned over and smiled at him. "You doing okay, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Jaden nodded without turning his head. "Yes, Mom." Mrs. Wilson looked at Sandra, then back at the boy. She had seen this kind of behavior before. It always made her sad and angry. Meanwhile, Sandra was still flipping through her magazine, pretending nothing had happened, but she could feel the eyes on her, and it bothered her. She leaned over to Rachel, who had just returned. "When are we taking off?" Rachel kept her face polite. "Soon, Mom." Sandra frowned again. "Well, I hope we don't have delays. I have important meetings." Rachel nodded. "Understood, Mom." She didn't say what she really wanted to say. Just then, the door to the cockpit opened. Captain Daniels stepped out. He was tall, confident, and wearing full uniform. His face was calm, but his eyes were sharp. He walked slowly down the aisle of first class, looking at each passenger, but mostly toward seat 2B. Some passengers noticed him and sat up straighter. Others whispered, "That's the captain." Sandra saw him too, but didn't think much. She assumed he was just passing by, until he stopped. Right beside her seat, Captain Daniels looked down at Jaden, who finally turned his head. When he saw his dad, his eyes lit up. "Hi, Dad," Jaden said quietly. Captain Daniels smiled and knelt beside him. "Hey, champ, you doing okay?" Jaden nodded and whispered, "I tried. I didn't cry." Sandra's eyes widened. Captain Daniels hugged his son tightly. "I'm proud of you." Then he stood up and turned toward Sandra. "Excuse me, ma'am. I think we need to talk." Sandra's mouth opened slightly. "Why?" Rachel stepped closer too. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Captain Daniels looked calm, but firm. "That young boy you didn't want to sit next to. He's my son." The cabin fell silent. Passengers stopped what they were doing. Every eye was on Sandra now. She looked around, unsure what to say. Her hands gripped the magazine tightly. Captain Daniels continued, "And yes, he belongs in first class, just like anyone else." Jaden looked at his dad, proud and hopeful. Mrs. Wilson across the aisle nodded approvingly. The story was just beginning. The silence in the first-class cabin was heavy. No one moved. No one spoke. Every passenger's eyes were now fixed on Captain Daniels and the woman sitting beside his son, Mrs. Sandra. For the first time, Sandra didn't know what to say. Her face turned pale, and her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her magazine tighter. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. Captain Daniels stood tall and calm, but the power in his voice couldn't be ignored. "My son was excited for this flight," he said, looking at Sandra. "This was supposed to be a happy day. But instead, you made him feel small. You treated him like he didn't belong." Sandra glanced around. Passengers were still staring at her. Some were frowning. Others whispered behind their hands. "I didn't know he was your son," Sandra said finally, her voice weak. The captain nodded slowly. "Would it have made a difference?" Sandra looked away. Rachel, the flight attendant, stepped forward. She placed her hand gently on Jaden's shoulder. "Jaden has been nothing but polite. He didn't complain. He didn't cry. He just sat there quietly." An older man in row 1, wearing a business suit, turned around and spoke. "It's not about who his father is. That boy deserves respect, no matter what." Mrs. Wilson from across the aisle added, "He has more class than most adults I've seen." Captain Daniels looked down at his son. Jaden's small eyes were watching him with admiration. He was trying to be strong, just like his dad. Then the captain turned back to Sandra. "You judged my son without knowing anything about him, without knowing who he is, where he comes from, what he dreams of." "I didn't mean," Sandra tried to say. But the captain raised a hand gently. "It's not just about you. It's about what we teach our children, what kind of world we're building. A seat in first class doesn't make you better than someone else. Kindness does." Jaden's eyes shimmered. For a moment, everyone saw him, not just as a child, but as someone important, someone strong. Rachel stepped forward again and said calmly, "Captain, do you want us to move your son?" Captain Daniels shook his head. "No, he stays right where he is. He has every right to be here." Sandra looked down at her lap. Her voice came out in a whisper. I didn't know." Captain Daniels didn't respond. He looked once more at Jaden, then at the passengers, and nodded. "Thank you all." Then he turned and walked back toward the cockpit. But the moment wasn't over. A young man seated behind Sandra raised his voice gently. "Hey, kid." Jaden looked up. "You want to trade seats? I got the window over here." Jaden gave a shy smile and shook his head. "I like this one." Everyone chuckled lightly. The tension in the cabin slowly began to fade. The plane was still on the runway, but something inside the people had already taken off. Rachel leaned down toward Jaden. "You okay, sweetheart?" Jaden nodded. "Yeah." Mrs. Wilson leaned over with a kind smile. "You remind me of my grandson. He's brave too." Jaden smiled back. But Sandra sat frozen in her seat. She didn't know what to say or how to feel. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Shame. And deep down, maybe even regret. The camera could now show the flight starting to move. Wheels turning slowly. The sun shining through the clouds. Jaden closed his eyes and leaned his head against the window, still holding the picture of him and his dad. The plane lifted off the ground. And so did the story. The passengers had witnessed something they wouldn't forget. And Sandra, she had just started learning the most important lesson of her life. The plane was now in the air, flying high above the clouds. Passengers slowly returned to their books, headphones, and drinks. But the mood in first class had changed. Jaden sat quietly in his seat, holding his toy plane, still looking out the window. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't sad anymore either. He was thinking. Sandra, on the other hand, hadn't said a word since Captain Daniels walked away. She sat stiffly, staring at the seat in front of her. Her hands stayed frozen on her lap. Rachel, the flight attendant, walked down the aisle again. She refilled drinks and checked on passengers. But she kept glancing at Jaden, her heart still heavy from earlier. As she passed by Sandra's seat, she paused. "Would you like anything to drink, ma'am?" she asked politely. Sandra didn't look up. "Just water." Rachel gave a small nod and moved on. In the row behind, two passengers whispered, "Did you hear that kid's dad is the captain?" "Yeah, and he handled it with so much class. I feel bad for the kid. Poor thing." Word was spreading. People didn't talk loudly, but the story was now traveling faster than the plane itself. Back in the cockpit, Captain Daniel stared straight ahead, his hands firm on the controls. But his mind wasn't fully on the flight. He was thinking about Jaden. He had raised his son to be strong, to be kind, to never let the world break him down. But days like this hurt. And not just for Jaden, for him too. His co-pilot glanced at him. "You okay, Captain?" Daniels gave a small nod. "Just thinking. About Jaden." "Yes, he's a good boy. He handled it like a champ," the co-pilot said. "Better than most adults would have." Daniels didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "It's hard. Watching your child face the same things you did. Things you hoped they would never have to go through." Back in the cabin, Jaden pulled out the photo from his pocket again. It showed him and his dad standing in front of the jet. Both were smiling. Both were happy. Sandra noticed it from the corner of her eye. She hesitated. Then, slowly, she turned her head toward him. "Is that your dad in the picture?" she asked in a quiet voice. Jaden looked at her, surprised that she spoke. He nodded. "Yes, Mom." "He's the pilot?" she asked again, her voice shaky. Jaden nodded once more. Sandra looked at the photo for a moment, then looked away. She took a deep breath. "I was wrong," she said quietly. "I judged you without knowing anything." Jaden didn't say anything. He just looked at her. Sandra added, "You didn't deserve that. I'm sorry." It was a weak apology, but it was real. Her voice was softer now. She sounded less proud, more human. Jaden gave a small nod. "It's okay." But deep inside, Sandra knew it wasn't. And she knew "I'm sorry" wasn't enough to erase what she did. Still, she had taken the first step. The flight continued. Near the middle of the journey, Rachel came back with a special snack tray. "This is for our little VIP," she said with a smile, placing it in front of Jaden. Jaden's eyes widened. "Wow, thank you." Sandra looked surprised. "VIP?" Rachel smiled politely. "Jaden is family. His father is not just the captain. He's one of the airline's top executives." Sandra froze. She looked at Jaden with new eyes. Not just as a boy, not just as someone's son, but as someone important. Her face turned red. She remembered the words she said earlier. "I paid for a premium seat. I won't sit next to him." And now, she was sitting next to the son of a man who could fire anyone on that plane, a man who led the airline she proudly flew with. The realization hit her hard. The flight was halfway to its destination. Jaden was now relaxed, enjoying his snacks. He smiled when the stewardess gave him a small pair of plastic wings, the kind given to children on their first flight. He pinned them to his shirt proudly. But beside him, Sandra was still deep in thought. She had apologized, yes, but something inside her still felt heavy. Embarrassed, guilty. The looks from other passengers, the words from the captain, the kindness of a child she had looked down on, all of it was still echoing in her mind. She looked at Jaden again. He had every reason to be rude to her. But he wasn't. He simply sat there with his soft eyes, quietly eating crackers and watching the clouds. Just then, Rachel returned. But this time, she wasn't holding a tray. She was smiling. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, looking at Sandra. "Would you mind stepping to the back for a moment? The captain would like a word with you." Sandra's stomach dropped. "A word? With me?" she asked, unsure. Rachel nodded kindly. if you don't mind." Sandra stood slowly, adjusting her jacket, and walked down the aisle with shaky steps. All eyes followed her. Back near the galley, Captain Daniels was waiting. His arms were crossed, but his expression wasn't angry. "Thank you for coming," he said. Sandra looked nervous. "Captain, I just want to say again, I didn't know who he was. I didn't mean to offend." The captain raised his hand gently. "I'm not here to punish you." She blinked. "I asked you here because I want to share something," he continued. "Not as a pilot, not as an executive, but as a father." Sandra stayed quiet. "My son, Caden, he has dreams. Big ones. He wants to be a pilot someday too. Just like me." Sandra slowly nodded. But today, someone told him, without using words, that he didn't belong, that his skin made him less. Sandra lowered her head. The captain paused. Then he added, "I've flown for over 20 years. I've carried thousands of passengers. But what matters most to me isn't flying high. It's lifting others." He looked directly at her. "I don't want you to feel ashamed. I want you to reflect, grow, change. Because what you say to a child, even without words, it stays." Sandra swallowed hard. She had no defense. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniels gave a small nod. "Go ahead and return to your seat." But as she turned, Rachel stopped her. "One more thing, ma'am," Rachel said gently. "The captain has arranged for a passenger swap. You'll be finishing the flight in economy class." Sandra froze. "What?" she asked, surprised. Rachel smiled kindly, but firmly. "A family with a small child needs a seat in first class. Jaden will stay where he is." Sandra was speechless. She didn't argue. She simply nodded and walked down the aisle. This time, not with pride, but with silence. Passengers watched her move past them, back to the main cabin. Back in first class, Jaden looked up as someone new sat beside him. It was the woman from earlier, Mrs. Wilson, the kind one from across the aisle. She smiled warmly. "Mind if I sit here for a bit?" Jaden nodded. "Sure." Mrs. Wilson leaned over and whispered, "You're a brave young man. Your father must be very proud." Jaden smiled. "He is." In the economy section, Sandra sat by the window. The seat was tighter, the space smaller. But that wasn't what bothered her. What bothered her was the lesson she had just learned, the hard way. Respect has nothing to do with where you sit, and everything to do with who you are. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Daniels looked at the photo pinned beside the controls. It was the same photo Jaden had in his pocket, father and son, smiling in front of a jet. He smiled softly and whispered to himself, "Fly high, little man. Fly high." The sun was starting to set outside the airplane windows, casting a golden glow across the clouds. Everything looked calm, peaceful, but deep inside, something powerful was changing. Jaden sat quietly, legs swinging, still in his seat. He had no idea how many people were now watching him, or how many hearts he had touched in just one short flight. He was only a boy, but his strength, his silence, and his smile had spoken louder than any words ever could. Back in economy class, Sandra sat by the window, her fingers nervously tapping her armrest. This seat was tighter. The meal wasn't warm. The noise from the back rows was louder. But none of that really mattered. What hurt more was the look in Jaden's eyes when she first refused to sit near him. A look of quiet pain. A look she would never forget. Her thoughts were spinning. How did I become that person? Why did I say those things? She stared out the window, her reflection mixing with the clouds. In the front of the plane, Mrs. Wilson, now sitting beside Jaden, handed him a small notebook. "I always travel with this," she smiled. "To write down things that matter. Maybe you'd like to write something too." Jaden took it carefully. He thought for a moment. Then slowly, with his small hand, he wrote one line across the page. "Kindness flies higher than any plane." He smiled. Mrs. Wilson looked at the words, then at Jaden. "That's beautiful," she whispered. "You should share that with the world." Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Daniels received a soft call from the flight crew. "Captain, a few passengers have requested to speak with you about your son." He smiled gently. "Tell them I'll come by soon." He looked at the small photo of Jaden again, then picked up the intercom microphone. The speakers across the plane came alive with his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're flying at 35,000 feet, and we'll be landing on time. But before we begin our descent, I want to share something with you." Passengers stopped what they were doing. Even the crew paused. "There's a special young man on this flight. You may not have noticed him at first, but maybe now you have. His name is Jaden, and he is my son." Heads turned. People looked around. Many already knew, but now the captain was speaking to everyone. He faced something today that no child should. He faced judgment, silence, coldness, all because of how he looks. Jaden looked up, surprised. His father was speaking about him in front of everyone. But he didn't respond with anger. He didn't complain. He showed strength, kindness, grace, and I want to thank him. The plane was silent. You could hear people breathing, listening. To the passengers who stood up, thank you. To the crew who protected him, thank you. And to those who still carry judgment in their hearts, this flight is a reminder. We're all passengers on the same journey. It's time we start treating each other that way. Click. The speaker went silent again, but the word hung in the air like stars. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. That message had been for her. Every word. Rachel passed by with tissues for a few teary-eyed passengers. Even Mrs. Wilson wiped a tear and gave Jaden's hand a gentle squeeze. "You made a difference today," she said. Jaden didn't fully understand how, but he felt it. Not in his head, but in his heart. The clouds began to part outside. Below them, the lights of the city were beginning to glow, signaling the journey was almost over. But for many on that flight, something new had just begun. The captain's voice still echoed in the hearts of the passengers as the plane began to descend. Through the window, the city lights grew brighter, and the runway came into view like a path lit by stars. Jaden sat with his little hands folded in his lap. His eyes watched the clouds drift by, but his mind was far away. He was thinking about the woman who didn't want to sit next to him, and how she looked when she realized who he was. He didn't hate her. He didn't even feel angry anymore. Because somewhere inside, he knew she had learned something. In the economy section, Sandra sat quietly, her face pale, her thoughts spinning like the wheels of the plane before landing. She clutched her purse tightly and stared straight ahead. How did I become this person? She had judged a child, a kind, quiet child, not knowing anything about him, not even caring to know. And now, that same child had given her the greatest lesson of her life. The plane touched down smoothly. Passengers clapped softly. Some smiled at each other. Some still wiped away tears. The atmosphere was different now. Something had changed. A moment in the sky had changed them. As the plane came to a stop, passengers slowly stood, grabbed their bags, and lined up in the aisle. When it was Jaden's turn to exit, he stood proudly. Rachel helped him with his small backpack and walked beside him. At the door, Captain Daniels was waiting. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. Jaden ran to him and hugged him tightly. "I'm proud of you," the captain whispered. Jaden smiled. "Thanks, Dad." The crew and a few nearby passengers smiled too. Some even clapped quietly for the boy. As they walked into the terminal, reporters and a few airport staff were already gathered. Someone had shared what happened on the flight. A woman in uniform stepped forward with a camera crew. "Captain Daniels," she said, "do you have a moment to speak about today's flight?" He looked at Jaden. Jaden looked up at his dad and nodded with a grin. The camera started rolling. Captain Daniels stood tall and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "This is my son," he said. "And today, he reminded us of something very important." He looked directly into the camera. "It's not the uniform, the seat, or the skin that makes a person worthy of respect. It's the heart. It's how you treat others." He paused. "And today, my son showed more heart than many grown adults ever do." The woman nodded. "What would you say to those watching?" Captain Daniels smiled softly. "Look at your children. Learn from them. And never let hate fly higher than kindness." The clip went viral that evening. Millions watched it. Some cried. Some apologized. Some changed. And among them was Sandra, now sitting in a hotel room, watching the news with tears in her eyes. She had seen herself in the video too. Not directly, but clearly enough. Her hand shook as she picked up her phone. She didn't want to hide. She wanted to do something right. The next day, a letter arrived at Captain Daniels' office. Handwritten. Carefully folded. Inside was a message. "Dear Jaden, I was wrong. You didn't just sit beside me. You taught me something. You showed me strength, kindness, and dignity. I'm sorry, and thank you. Sandra." Jaden smiled when he read it. "Can I write back?" he asked. Captain Daniels nodded. "Of course, buddy." Jaden grabbed his pen and wrote simply, "Dear Sandra, everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what we do after. I forgive you. Jaden." Weeks had passed since the flight, but the story of Jaden and the woman who refused to sit near him was still being talked about, not just in airports, but around the world. Newspapers called it the flight that changed hearts. TV shows praised Jaden's grace and calm. And across social media, people of all backgrounds shared the story with hashtags like #kindness in first class and #Jaden taught me. In his quiet bedroom, Jaden sat at his small desk. He wasn't watching cartoons or playing games. He was writing. Letter after letter. Not just to Sandra, but to others. Kids who were bullied. People who felt left out. Strangers who wrote to him for hope. His words were simple, honest, full of heart, and people were listening. At school, Jaden was no longer just another kid. He was a symbol of strength. When other children were teased, he stood up for them. When new students arrived, he sat beside them. He didn't act better than anyone else. He just showed the kindness he always believed in. And slowly, other kids began to do the same. One day, the principal called him to the front office. "Jaden," she said with a warm smile, "there's someone here to see you." He walked into the room and stopped. There, standing near the window, was Sandra, not dressed in fancy clothes, not with a proud face. She stood with humility, and beside her was a small book in her hands. "I came to say thank you," she said softly, "and to give you this." She handed Jaden the book. On the cover, it read, "Kindness Flies Higher, The Story of a Boy Who Taught Me How to See," by Sandra M. Reeves. Jaden looked up, surprised. "You wrote a book?" he asked. She nodded. "I told the world what I did, and what you taught me." Tears welled in her eyes. "You helped me find the person I was meant to be." Jaden didn't know what to say, so he just smiled. That night, Sandra spoke at a community center, with Jaden sitting in the front row. She told the story of her mistake, her shame, and how one child changed her heart, without shouting, without hate. People listened closely, and many cried, because in Jaden's story, they saw a part of their own. Meanwhile, Captain Daniels stood at the back, watching his son proudly. He wasn't just a pilot anymore. He was a father of a quiet hero, and he knew something important now. Jaden's journey wasn't just about one flight. It was just the beginning. A few months later, Jaden's story was turned into a children's book, then a short film, then an award ceremony where he was honored for his courage and kindness. But Jaden never let it go to his head. He still played with his friends. He still hugged his dad at night. He still believed in one simple truth. When we choose kindness, we all fly higher. As the sun set outside his window one evening, Jaden looked at the sky. The same sky where it all began. The same sky that still carried the echoes of a flight, a mistake, and a change that spread like light. Because in the end, Jaden didn't just teach the world a lesson. He gave it hope.